Have you ever felt that someone from the past is still watching you? That certain love stories never end, even after death? Imagine falling in love with someone marked by a dark secret, and find out that this history is still being written. In the previous episode, Beatriz and Miguel face something that should no longer exist. Helena, a shadow of the past, a ghostly presence that does not accept to be forgotten. But what if this lost love still has a score to settle? What if Helena is not willing to leave them alone? Get ready, because tonight the barriers between the living and the dead will break down. And when that happens, there is no turning back. What does Miguel hide? What has Beatriz not yet discovered? And, more importantly, can love survive the impossible? Stay until the end, because this episode will mess with your mind and with your heart. Before we start, a warning. This episode is simply not to be missed. If you haven't signed up yet, now is the time. Click on the subscribe button, activate the bell, and get ready, because what comes next will give you goosebumps. The silence was dense, almost palpable. The mansion remained shrouded in darkness, as if time itself hesitated to continue flowing within those walls. The air carried a weight, a mixture of mystery and danger, but also something unexpected. A different warmth, a connection that no one could have predicted. Beatrice felt her heart hammering in her chest. His eyes were fixed on Michael's, who held his hand firmly. For an instant, his presence drove away the overwhelming fear that consumed the house. They were closer than ever, united by danger, by the unknown, and for something deeper that grew between the two. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." Miguel's voice came out low, but full of conviction. Beatrice felt a shiver run down her spine. She didn't know if it was because of fear or the way he looked at her, as if promising to protect her at any cost. His breathing was quick, his body tense. The world around him seemed to have faded for an instant. But then, a noise echoed from upstairs. Something heavy dragged on, followed by a scratchy sound, like fingernails scraping against wood. The illusion of security they shared for that brief moment dissipated. "We need to get out of here, now." Miguel pulled her, but Beatrice hesitated. What if it's one of them?" His voice was a trembling whisper. They knew what they were talking about. The specters of that house were not simple apparitions. They were imprisoned souls, entities that carried with them hatred, pain, and buried secrets. And now, one of them was there. Hearing, watching. The air became cold. Miguel noticed the change in the environment and instinctively pulled Beatrice closer, his body forming a protective shield around her. The proximity made Beatrice feel his heat against her skin, which contrasted in an almost cruel way with the cold that spread through the environment. "I'll get you out of here," Miguel promised again, his voice lower, almost a whisper against her ear. Beatrice's gaze met his, and for a moment, she was lost in that silent exchange. It was crazy to think about it now, in the midst of danger, but there was something there, something that went beyond adrenaline, beyond fear. But before any of them could process what they were feeling, a bang rang out from upstairs. Something had fallen, something heavy. The ground shook, and then footsteps began to echo. Heavy, slow steps that went down the stairs towards them. Miguel shook Beatrice's hand. She felt his pulse quicken, but her gaze remained steady. There was something different about him now, something fierce. They couldn't run forever. This time, they were going to face whatever was waiting for them. And together, perhaps they would discover that the real terror was not in the ghosts of the house, but in the secrets buried in his own heart. The sound of footsteps became clearer. Every knock against the old wood of the stairs reverberated down the hallway like a grim warning. Beatrice felt her breath held in her chest, and Miguel kept his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Whatever was coming down, it was coming straight for them. Beatrice's mind worked at 1,000. They were cornered. If they ran to the right, they would come face to face with the corridor that would lead them to the west wing of the house. But she already knew that that side was filled with living darkness, a suffocating presence that seemed to devour everything around. To the left, there was the library, a room where they had found old records of the mansion, but also where they heard whispers that did not belong to anyone alive. The only way out was move on. Miguel seemed to read his thoughts. He squeezed her hand and pulled her lightly, a silent sign that she needed to trust him. Beatrice nodded, trying to ignore the chill down her spine, and followed in her footsteps. They moved forward carefully, trying not to make a sound. The hallway was dimly lit by a flickering oil lamp that someone or something had left burning. The shadows of the flames played on the walls, creating distorted, almost human shapes. The sound of footsteps continued, but now it seemed more erratic, as if the entity following them was hesitating. Beatrice felt a tightness in her chest. It was as if the presence knew they were there, but could not see them clearly. That's when a new sound filled the silence. A whisper, low, scratched. "Don't trust in nobody." Beatrice stopped. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it was going to jump out of her chest. The whisper didn't come from the stairs. It came from behind them, inside the corridor itself. Miguel also noticed and stopped, his body tensing next to him. He turned his face slightly to look over his shoulder, but there was nothing, just the hallway stretching out in shadows. "What's wrong?" Beatrice asked in a thread of voice. Miguel took a second to respond. "I saw something," he whispered, "but I can't tell you what it was." She swallowed. They didn't need to know. They just needed to get out of there. But before they could take another step, a gust of icy wind swept across the hallway, extinguishing the lamp and plunging everything into absolute darkness. And then the voice whispered again, this time very close to Beatrice's ear. "He is lying." Beatrice turned sharply, her heart out of control, but there was nothing there. Darkness surrounded them completely. She wanted to scream, she wanted to run, but Miguel held her wrist firm, bringing her closer. His touch was warm against her icy skin, and it made her cling to the only certainty she had at that moment. He was there. "Don't listen to that," Miguel murmured, his voice so low it sounded like a thought lost in the wind. "They want to confuse you. But what if it weren't for that? What if there was something Miguel wasn't telling? She couldn't think about it now. The sound of footsteps returned, but this time it came from all sides. That's when the library door opened by itself. With a bang, an invisible force pulled Beatrice into the dark room. She screamed, feeling Miguel's fingers slide from hers, but he grabbed her at the last second, pulling her back. The two fell on the hardwood floor of the library. The door closed behind them with a deafening thud. Now they were in prison, and they were not alone. In the corner of the room, something began to move, silent, watching. Beatrice felt the air heavy. His vision slowly adjusted to the dim light, and it was then that he noticed. There was someone there, or something, and I was waiting for them. The air inside the library was thick, charged with an invisible electricity that made the hairs on Beatrice's body stand on end. The silence was absolute, but she knew they were not alone. In the darkest corner of the room, something moved slowly. Miguel also felt it. His body tensed beside her, his muscles stiff as if ready to react to any sudden movement. Beatrice tried to calm her own breathing, but her chest rose and fell at a frantic pace. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, but each shadow seemed to take on a life of its own. Miguel grabbed her arm, pulling her back slightly, and that's when the sound began. A low scratch, like fingernails scraping against wood. Beatrice shuddered. The sound came from the back of the library, near the old bookshelves that were stacked to the ceiling. The scratching continued, slow, methodical, as if something was scratching the floor on purpose, wanting them to hear it. It was then that they saw it. Between the shelves, a silhouette moved. It was not human. Beatrice's heart raced. Her mind screamed to run away, but something in her said that this time, running was not an option. They were locked there, and whatever was in that library, he didn't intend to let them leave so easily. Miguel grabbed his flashlight, but before he could turn it on, the silhouette moved with absurd speed. An icy wind swept through the library, and the faint moonlight coming in through the window revealed for an instant what lay before them. A woman, or something that was once one. Her face was partially covered by an ancient torn veil, and her skin seemed to dissolve into shadows. Her eyes were black holes, bottomless, and her mouth opened in a whisper so low that Beatrice could barely understand. "You returned." Miguel froze. Beatrice felt the grip of his hand on her arm intensify. There was something in those words, something that seemed staff. The spectral figure tilted its head slowly, as if studying them. Then he took a step forward. "You shouldn't have come back." Fear pulsated within Beatrice, but a part of her wanted to understand. I wanted to know what that thing meant. He wanted to understand why Miguel seemed to recognize those words. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The spectral woman did not answer. Her blank gaze turned to Miguel. "You, Prometheus." Beatrice turned to him, waiting for an answer, but Miguel said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the apparition, and his jaw clenched. "Michael?" Her voice came out more hesitant now. He gulped, but before he could speak, the entity moved. Too fast. Suddenly she was a few inches away from them. Beatrice felt the icy presence envelop her body, as if invisible hands were trying to pull her into an endless abyss. She tried to move, but it was as if the air around her had solidified. Miguel grabbed her wrist and pulled her back, breaking contact with the evil presence. The entity then retreated, its empty eyes fixing again on Miguel. He still loves her." Beatrice felt a shiver down her spine. What did that mean? Who was that thing talking about? Miguel's face hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about." The creature tilted its head. "Don't lie." The library shook. Books fell from the shelves, the floor vibrated under Beatrice's feet, and a suffocating energy filled the room. The entity began to dissolve into shadows, but before disappearing completely, it whispered something that made Beatrice's heart freeze. "She is waiting for you." And then the silence returned. The presence disappeared, but the cold remained. Beatrice breathed with difficulty. She turned to Miguel, waiting for him to say something, to explain anything. But he just stood still, staring into the void, his eyes laden with a weight she had never seen before. "What was that, Miguel?" she asked, almost voiceless. He did not immediately respond. He just closed his eyes for a moment, as if he were fighting something inside him. And then, finally, he whispered, I think I know who she was." Beatrice felt her heart stop for a moment. "Who?" His voice came out shaky. Miguel looked at her. "My fiancé." Beatrice felt the world around her spin. She didn't know what hurt more, the fact that Miguel had hidden it from her, or the fact that the entity was still waiting for him. And worse, that maybe deep down, Miguel still loved her. The silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. Beatrice's heart beat so hard that she felt the pulse on her fingertips. The unspoken name hovered between them, like a ghost more real than any spirit they had ever faced, Miguel's fiancé. Beatrice felt her stomach sink, a sensation of vertigo pulling her into an unknown abyss. She always knew that Miguel had a past, but she never imagined that he was directly linked to that curse. And now it all made sense. His distant gaze, the weight on his shoulders, the way he always hesitated when talking about his past. "Michael," she tried to say something, but her voice failed. He finally stared at her, and what Beatrice saw in his eyes wasn't just sadness. It was guilt, a guilt so deep that it seemed engraved in his soul. "I never talked about her because I thought I had left all that behind." He ran his hand over his face, exhausted. "But it seems I was wrong." Beatrice wanted to ask more. I wanted to know who this woman was, what their story was, why she was still there. But at the same time, a part of her was afraid of the answers. After all, she didn't know if she wanted to hear that Miguel still had feelings for her. "Did you love her?" The question escaped her before she could contain herself. Miguel took a second to respond. A second that seemed like an eternity. Yes. The answer was direct, bluntly, and it hurt. Beatrice felt her chest tighten. She never considered herself a jealous woman, but this was different. It was a shadow of the past that could not be fought. A shadow that was literally there, waiting for Miguel. She looked away, trying to stay calm. And what happened to her? Miguel closed his eyes for a moment, as if the answer was something he didn't want to relive. She died. His voice was almost a whisper. Here. Beatrice's heart stopped. How? She asked, feeling her skin crawl. Miguel took a deep breath, as if he was gathering courage. Years ago, before I left this city, me and my fiancée, Helena, we came to this house. At the time, she was already considered cursed, but we were young and stupid. We wanted to prove that the rumors were nothing more than legends. He paused, his gaze lost in the void. But we were wrong. Beatrice stood motionless, waiting for every word with an almost suffocating anxiety. Something happened that night, Miguel continued. Something I don't remember well. What I do know is that when I woke up, she was no longer with me. I looked for her everywhere, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. He ran his hand through his hair, exasperated. The only thing I found was her veil, in the same place where we saw that apparition just now. Beatrice felt a chill down her spine. Do you think she's still here? His voice came out low, almost a whisper. Miguel hesitated. I don't know, but if it's her, so something is very wrong. Beatrice didn't know what to think. The shock of the revelation still weighed on her. But before he could organize his thoughts, a sound echoed through the library. A cry, coming from the hallway. The two turned around at the same time, the tension between them forgotten the moment the sound got louder. It was a feminine cry, low, anguished, loaded with pain and loneliness. Beatrice swallowed. Is this real? She asked, feeling her body tremble. Miguel looked at her, and this time his eyes had no doubts. Yes, the crying intensified as if it was approaching. And then, among the shadows of the hallway, something moved. A white veil, floating in the dark. Beatrice's heart almost came out of her mouth. Miguel. She grabbed his arm, squeezing tightly, but Miguel did not react. He was hypnotized, looking at that veil as if he were seeing a ghost, and maybe he was. The crying turned into a whisper. You're back. Beatrice felt her blood run cold. The silhouette began to take shape. It was her, the spirit of Helena, and she didn't seem happy to see them. Time seemed to stop. Beatrice felt her muscles lock, her breathing became shallow, and her heart hammered against her chest as if she wanted to escape from there. The white veil floated in the dark, and soon, under the gloom of the corridor, the figure of Helena took shape. She was a tall woman, dressed in an antique wedding dress, rumpled and dirty with time. His eyes were a deep, lifeless void, but inside them was something, a latent pain, a resentment that transcended death itself. She stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Miguel. You're back, the spectral voice echoed, charged with indescribable grief. Beatrice held Miguel's arm tighter, waiting for him to back off, but he didn't move. His eyes were fixed on her, on the woman he once loved, on the shadow that now stared at them as if she still expected something from him. Helena! Miguel's voice came out trembling, a whisper lost in the silence. Helena tilted her head, as if she were evaluating every word he said, every shred of feeling that might still be left inside him. Then, slowly, she raised one hand. The air in the room became heavier. Beatrice felt a biting cold, as if the temperature had dropped drastically in a matter of seconds. A shiver ran down her spine when she realized that Helena's hand wasn't pointed at Miguel. It was pointed at her. You shouldn't be here. The voice of the apparition sounded firmer, colder. Beatrice felt her throat dry up. What? She tried to speak, but her voice came out cracking. The pressure around him increased. The sails in the library fluttered, and an icy wind blew through her hair. Miguel finally reacted, moving in front of Beatriz as a protective instinct. "Helena, no!" He raised his hands as if he could calm his spirit. But Helena's eyes sparkled with something different, something darker. "Have you forgotten me, Miguel?" His voice now carried a more intense emotion. Sadness, anger, a mixture of everything. "You left me here, alone." She took another step, and the ground creaked beneath her feet as if the house itself was reacting to her presence. "I've never forgotten you." Miguel tried to get closer, but her answer came quickly. "Lie." Her tone was dry, almost cruel. The word resounded through the room, and in the blink of an eye, something invisible hit Miguel, throwing him back with force. He crashed into one of the shelves of books, which collapsed on impact. "Michael!" Beatrice screamed, turning to help him. But before she could take a step, an invisible weight pulled her back. "You took the place that was mine." Helena's voice now hissed directly in Beatrice's ear. Fear ran through every cell of his body. Something cold touched his skin, invisible fingers slipping down his arm, squeezing with an unearthly force. Beatrice tried to resist, tried to move, but her body seemed frozen. It was then that Miguel stood up, panting. "Helena, stop!" he shouted, his voice full of despair. The apparition froze for a second. The time was enough for Beatrice to let go, staggering backwards, the air returning sharply to her lungs. Helena's face contorted in pain. Her eyes were fixed on Miguel. "You really chose her?" His voice was now low, full of sorrow. Miguel hesitated. For a moment, all was silent. Beatrice held her breath, waiting for his answer. But before he could say anything, Helena took a step back. Her body began to unravel into shadows, the contours of her dress dissolving into thin air. "This is not over yet." Her whisper was the last thing they heard before she disappeared completely. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Beatrice breathed hard, trying to understand what had just happened. Miguel was still standing in the same place, his eyes fixed on where Helena had been. "Michael!" Beatrice tried to call him. He did not immediately respond. When he finally turned to her, there was something different in his gaze. "We need to get out of here," he said firmly. "Now." Beatrice did not argue. They moved quickly through the library, grabbing only what they needed before running to the main door. But when they reached the hallway, they realized something terrible. The house was different. The hallways seemed longer, the doors were where they shouldn't be. The environment seemed to distort, as if the walls themselves were moving. "Miguel, what's happening?" Beatrice held his hand, feeling a deep chill. He looked around, trying to find a way out. It was then that Helena's voice whispered through the whole house, coming from all directions. "You'll never leave here." And all the lights went out, and with that the plot thickens, and the mystery seems deeper than ever. But the real answer is yet to come. What does the future hold for our protagonists? The story is far from over. Don't miss the next episode, where hidden secrets will finally come to light. Sign up now so you don't miss a single moment of this spine-chilling journey.